with Alex, and I really enjoyed it, so it's always a pleasant feedback. Today I'll be talking about improving decision-making and system performance transportation through mobile phone data. I will be giving, so as an outline, I'll be talking about two use cases that are fairly different. The reason I'm doing that is I want to show you some sort of breadth in what you can do with mobile phone data. So first, I'll give you some background about what I mean by mobile phone data. Then I'll talk about measuring airport performance from a passenger perspective. So how you can use mobile phone data for air passengers, how performance degradation in the air transportation side happens with a case study of a bomb cyclone, and then we'll talk about the passenger door-to-door journey, meaning from their home to their final destination. And second part of this talk, I'll discuss how we can monitor the impact of natural disasters on local populations. I'll discuss Hurricane Harvey about a year and a half ago in Texas, how we monitored anomalies in population density and movements, and then I'll explain how the recovery process was uneven and how we can measure that. So, a little bit of background. Mobile phone data. Who doesn't have their cell phone on them today? Okay, who has two?
Someone should do this in their head.
Okay. Who hasn't used their cell phone any day in the past week? When was the last time you forgot your cell phone? Yeah, it's really bad, right?
1 week ago.
Yeah. It was a terrible day, right? You couldn't do anything. Okay, so the data set I have is about 70 million users in the US. That's about the location data. Basically, every time you make a phone call, you text, or you get a notification in your pocket through the internet, that provides an approximate location, latitude, longitude, with a few hundred meters accuracy, sometimes a little more, anywhere in the US. And for 70 million people, that's about 500 gigs of data per day. It's not something you can just look manually and see what's going on. You need big data tools for that. So the records, basically you get an anonymized user ID, a timestamp, and an approximate latitude and longitude. The purpose of this talk is to show that mobile phone data can provide large-scale, near real-time, very granular insight for various transportation applications. So let's talk about air passengers. I'm originally an aerospace engineer, and I worked on some, airline, airport problems. And what's really striking is that airports are the bottleneck of the transportation system, but mostly that the stakeholders have a very fragmented way of the situation. Nobody knows what you're doing all the way from your home to your hotel when you're going on holiday. Capacity constraints and inefficiencies at airports happen at entry roads, parking, security, immigration, customs, gates, and when you have runway congestion once you're in the airplane. So congestion and delays sort of stack up, and it depends on which airport you're at, depends how far away you are from the airport, depends which mode of transportation you took. I mean, it's really hard to see the whole picture. And so, moreover, these stakeholders do not rely on each other or do not want to share information because they are often competitors. So they have zero incentive to share. And what's going on here, with information that's fragmented, airlines have information about their passengers. They know when you bought your ticket, they know maybe if you're a frequent flyer, they know when you check in online or physically at the airport, they know when you drop your bags, and when you swipe going into the airplane. Airports know about customs and security records, queue length, maybe shuttle traffic, parking occupancy, because that's how they make money. And third parties may collect traces in Wi-Fi or Bluetooth beacons inside the airport. No one has a whole view of what's going on. And currently, the Bureau of Transportation Statistics provides what's basically the only metric of how to measure performance. It's on-time performance. That means they measure flight delays, cancellations, maybe there was a flight diversion, so on and so forth. You might also be able to find some data about tickets, like a small portion of the tickets issued in the US by a bunch of airlines. And yet, everybody talks about putting the passenger at the core of the system because it's the one that's making the system work. And flight delays do not represent passenger delay. You have a flight delay on your first leg, you're going, let's say, to I'm going to take Oakland. No, I'm going to take San Francisco Airport because it has a lot more connections. San Francisco, you go to LA and then you connect to LA and then you go to New York. If your first leg is delayed, And on the air transportation side of things, the metric, it may say, okay, you had 45 minutes delay on a 2-hour flight, it's not that bad. But you miss your connection in LA. And so then your total trip delay is massive. Because you might not be able to take a flight right away, there might not be room on the next flight, and so on and so forth. Passengers are the raison d'etre of the overall transportation system. And in one side you have NextGen in the US, and the other side you have, hi, come on in. You have Cesar in Europe. And they're both setting ambitious goals about door-to-door travel time. A few years back, Cesar said, anywhere in Europe we want door-to-door travel on average to be less than 4 hours. You're like, okay, when I live an hour from Paris, it takes me an hour to go to Charles de Gaulle, and that's a good day. Then it takes me an hour inside the airport. When I get on my flight to, let's say, Rome, let's say I'm going to Rome, it takes me another hour or something, and I'm trying to go to the center of Rome. Maybe I get 4 hours for a very short flight, and that's because I'm not very far from my destination. The real problem I have with this statement is no one knows how to measure it. It's nice to set ambitious goals about door-to-door travel times, but how do you measure it? Who can do that? So today we'll talk about how we can possibly try and measure it in the end. So, who's a passenger? Currently, only airlines know who's a passenger, and maybe some of the airports, they see you going through the custom, they don't really know where you're going. So, what I did with the phone data is I really took the top 40-something airport in the US. I drew a nice little box around the top airport, and you could be very lazy. You could just say, who's in that box? Are there passengers? Wait, I have taxi cabs. I have airport workers. It's really hard. And you can take just the whole US, your 500 gigs of data per day, say, okay, who was in 2 airports today? Oh, they're probably a passenger, unless it's like JFK Newark, so we did some filtering there. But if you're in 2 airports in the US, you're probably an air passenger, or you work for an airline. But we won't look at you because that's too precise. And when you're trying to get rid of any identifying information, you just keep anonymized user ID, and you said he was in, let's say, Atlanta, and we first saw him in that little box, or her, in that little box at time t, and we last saw him at time t plus something. So that's the time spent in the airport. And we get rid of any identifying information, latitude, longitude, anything like that. This gives you, hopefully, passengers, domestic. So on the left here, you have for each airport, top 40 airports, up to Atlanta, I ordered them at sort of volume, origin destination matrix of who I think are passengers on one day in the entire US. This is on the right, the same origin destination matrix, but with flights data. So it's not proportional because you have big flights with more passengers and so on and so forth. But you see first the structure is fairly the same. I mean, you see the hub and spoke structure. Since the airports are ordered by volume at the beginning, you see much more connection between the top airports, and then they distribute the traffic to other airports. You see the same sort of anomalies, like San Diego to San Francisco, Salt Lake to Denver, and so on and so forth. So the red dots, red boxes where you have more traffic. So it's a first indication that we are capturing something that is indeed passengers. The hub and spoke structure is right there. So I looked at a case study, the bomb cyclone, that happened just a year ago. There was a massive blizzard on the East Coast with a peak on January 4th. They announced over 90% of flight cancellation at LaGuardia, 70% at Newark, 20% at JFK. It's really bad. They knew it was going to be bad. The question was how bad. What really happened is what JFK and LaGuardia closed for safety measures. At 10:45 on January 4th, JFK closed, was supposed to reopen in the afternoon and then in the evening and then only finally the next day. And then 3 days later, was so cold that water pipes broke at JFK Terminal 4. That's a picture over there. That's a terminal flooded. So no one in the terminal anymore. They had to be evacuated. And so they had flooded terminal and flooded baggage. So really the worst situation they could get. So I took from December 27th, so these are airports, Los Angeles, Atlanta, Denver, and so on. This is the number of passengers on the left that we identified. And you have, so each dot is a different day. The green dot is what you care about, it's January 4th. And so you see that, for instance, this is Sacramento. They don't get any disturbance. They have no traffic, and it's the same every day. You see a place like JFK, wow, they had a really bad day here, no passenger whatsoever. I mean, there could have been people in the terminal, but nobody flew out of JFK that day. And so it's really visual. I mean, you just look for the little dots that are completely off compared to usual. These are your anomalies. Turns out it's exactly the days where the bomb cyclone happened. So that's our first indication that we are capturing something about the system with mobile phone data. Now, you can look at performance from a passenger perspective. So on the top, you have, so the y-axis is the time spent at the departure airport in minutes, because people spend longer at departure than at arrival. Typically, you see here, people spend about 100-something minutes at departure on average across all airports. That's what's recommended. The TSA actually says 90 minutes for domestic passengers. That's time spent at arrival, so people spend about maybe 40 minutes at arrival between the time they take down, they immediately take their phone out, to the time they exit the airport boundary. So that's normal performance. You can see the good performers, the bad performers at departure, at arrival. So you see a lot more variations. For instance, Orlando over there, MCO is not doing super well at departure. Like this is January 2nd. Atlanta has a lot of variability. You see the standard deviation being fairly high. Okay. Now you look at January 5th, one of the bad days, just after the bomb cyclone. Well, suddenly your performance is quite different. Like this, JFK right there, not doing well. Newark also not doing well. Boston not doing well either. And it's just measurement. It's just a way of aggregating data, a lot of data, and observing what's going on. So we can tell you how much longer people wait at the airport to get their flight, or if they got there earlier than usual, because you can actually look at the distribution compared to the previous distribution in time.
Does this include passengers who are connecting?
Yes. I can tell you the connections too. I won't go into that today. But you can find the exact connections. And you can actually see during disturbances the drop in number of connecting passengers. We can measure that. So this was to tell you, first, we can identify passengers. Second, it is indeed a valid measurement of passengers, which nobody currently has because passenger data is proprietary, it belongs to airlines. And then you can have a way to benchmark airports, because which airport would want to say, oh, I'm a really great airport, because on average people only have to spend 40 minutes at departure, we're very efficient. Whereas, and you could compare performance across airports, not just from a departure delay on the airplane perspective. What's nice is getting context. Look here, people love tweeting. This is somebody saying, working on that diamond medallion status, #Delta. It's not too early. So we got the Twitter data for the same time period, December 27th, 2017, January 12th, 2018. We just literally scraped Twitter with a few handles, the airlines handle, United, Delta, American Airlines, Southwest, and so on, a few airports that we were interested in. And we just collected the tweet, the timestamp, the text associated, and the handles that we scraped. So on the upper left is the daily volume of tweets per airline. Sorry, I thought this would be quicker. And then this is the daily volume of tweets per airport. You see this is JFK. It's really spiking during the bomb cycle. When people are bored and waiting, they tweet. And you see that. And this is the same plot on the right, but just hourly, so you can really pinpoint when things happen. So you could be monitoring Twitter, and so you could have on one side the mobile phone data that tells you how many passengers are waiting, or how many passengers are in the terminal, and you could get the context on Twitter with some simple anomaly detection here. The spikes are obvious. It does happen that people will spike about passengers being kicked out of airplanes, so you have to filter that. So then we tried to look at keywords, and we were very lazy. We did some topic modeling. People are very basic on Twitter. They just use keywords. There's no need for topic modeling. We tried that. So delay keywords, cancellation keywords. And it's interesting because you can distinguish exactly when people are getting delayed and when the cancellations happen. So you see the recovery the day of the bomb cyclone, lots of cancellations. The next few days, more delays. So the trade-off is also visible on Twitter. And so getting to the full passenger door-to-door journey. It's one thing to be traveling, but the question is, how do you get there? How long is it going to take? So this is somebody went from San Francisco, so actually from Hayward to San Francisco Airport with bridge, then stayed connected through LA. They were on arrived in the terminal, and then landed at DCA, Reagan Airport in DC, and went to downtown DC. That's one person. I don't look at individual users, this is just to show you an example, and so we aggregate all of that. And here, this is JFK Newark. I'm showing you each dot is a zip code. The darker the dots, the more people travel from that zip code to the airport. Well, it's pretty obvious LaGuardia and JFK are competing for their customers, and Newark has a completely different customer base. Like, no one is going to go from Long Island to Newark. It's just pointless. It's just painful. But this is now completely observable. I mean, then you can look at modes of transportation further. That's something we're looking at. But you can look at market competition that way. This also has implication for planning, like which ways people used to go to the airport, and so on and so forth. So, an intermediate conclusion, trying to convince you that mobile phones are valid sensors, even for air transportation. I mean, you'd think in the air it doesn't matter, but we're just looking at what's happening on the ground. We have a way to get reliable, system-wide, passenger-centric metrics. We can get a sort of unbiased benchmark of airport performance. We can have an objective measurement of the impact of severe perturbation. And we can get useful information for urban planning around airports. All right. So if you like passengers, if you're a passenger, there's stuff to be done. So now we're going to discuss the impact of natural disasters. It sounds unrelated. The reason we got into it is because we see a lot of population movements, and some of them are anomalies. So we tried thinking about what was going on. So first, disclaimer, natural disasters in the US happen year-round. I'm going to focus on a few events and show that it can generalize. So this was Hurricane Harvey. This was summer of 2017 in Texas, particularly this area near Corpus Christi to Houston. 13 million people were affected, over 100,000 homes damaged, 125 billion estimated cost in dollars. There were over 800,000 FEMA assistant applications. FEMA is a federal emergency management agency across 41 Texas counties. To get an idea of what's going on, August 25, Harvey was a Category 4 hurricane, made landfall in Rockport, Texas, that's south. It stalled and produced catastrophic flooding. On August 29, it dumped a year's worth of rainfall over a week in Houston. 2 flood control reservoirs had to be reached to end the increased flooding in Houston. Then it finally went up the coast and made the final landing near Port Arthur, Texas, bringing flooding as well. And months later, the news was still reporting that residents were not able to go back home because they were too badly damaged, and they were still waiting for their claims to be processed. It was really overwhelming. And then there were other hurricanes. There was Maria in Puerto Rico. There was Irma in Florida. Just too much to handle. So what's really hard during natural disasters is that you have this nice weather. At first, it's not super predictable. I mean, we have good models, but sometimes you miss a little bit. But then, how do you assess to what's happening on the ground? So that's what we'll go into. So the raw data set is a month of mobile phone data. For this exact area of Texas, that's about 200 gigs of data. So remember, we have an anonymous user ID, a timestamp, an approximate latitude, longitude every time you use your phone or your phone pings in the background. So first we aggregate for each user in each zip code, each day. We just keep the first and last timestamp in that zip code, which is called any identifying information. And then just in each zip code and each city, we examine how many unique users, how many records, and what was your average dwell time in that location. And finally, I record all daily origin-destination pairs at the zip code and city level. So if you travel through different cities, I'll just keep these hops. Not the whole travel, but just the hops. So each day, mid-August, hurricane made landfall, which is the number of unique users in that geographic area, that box. We went from typically 1 million, 1.2 million to like 1.1 million. Literally 100,000 people in our users evacuated this area, like this box, they just left because of the hurricane. So evacuated east, west, north, they just left. And then you see this number of unique users and goes back to normal. This is the average number of records per user per day across cities. So basically, how many times your phone pings in a given city. And here you see a peak during about the same time period. So the day of the hurricane, less, because less records, there was some damage, but then a lot more, because people use their phone a lot more when they're in distress or when they need to get information. So first, two different anomalies: less users, more usage. Okay, so here I'm trying to show you the impact in terms of static anomalies, the density of people per zip code. So each zip code is color-coded according to the number of unique users in that zip code that day. Top left is normal situation. So the darker the pink, the more people you have. Very dark pink on the right, that's Houston. On the left, that's San Antonio. August 24 in the top middle, that's when people start to know really it's going to happen tomorrow. So they start leaving a little bit at the bottom. So you see at the bottom near Corpus Christi, I'll show you the map again here. Look for here, they start leaving that way. You'll see more unique users at the bottom. And then on the 25th, when the hurricane makes landfall in the south, just everybody's not doing what they're usually doing. So when you look at number of unique users in the zip code, it includes two things: people who live there, people who work there or commute there. So if you have less people, it means people are just staying home and they're not going to their usual places. And then 26, 27, things go back to normal near Corpus Christi, but then it moves north, and you see some areas of Houston emptying out. It empties out along the coast, then it goes back to normal, and it starts emptying out in this area when the hurricane made its final landfall. So that's a way to look at static anomalies. Now you can look at more mobility patterns, and I think that's more easy to see. So these are the hops that people go to from city to city. So again, top left, before the hurricane. In the middle, on the top, you see suddenly an increase in activity. Before the hurricane, people are leaving. They are much more mobile than usual. And then the day the hurricane makes landfall in Corpus Christi, that's the top right, you see no movement anymore in that area. Everybody's just staying still at home. You see when the hurricane really starts dumping tons of rain, no movement whatsoever. Same thing here. Corpus Christi is starting to be a little bit better. Not less people in Houston moving. And then you really see the progression, mobility disappearing as the hurricane moves east and going back to normal here. And then you get back to a more normal situation afterwards. So you can really measure what's going on. Why do we care? Because knowing how people are evacuating, where they're evacuating, is important. The timing of the event is important. The static anomalies are important because and we'll go into that in more detail, because you need to know if people haven't left. And then you can have infrastructure damage, so sometimes you don't have the information, but you need to know how many people were still there before things went bad. So that's exactly the structure. So each color is a different day for a month. This is the number of cities visited per user per day, 1, 2, 3, and so on. Number of users who visit only one city per day, 2 cities per day, and so on. We see that during the days of the hurricane in the middle, it's really the middle of the data set, most people are they're just staying in the old city, they're not going anywhere. But usually they were going to 3, 4, 5, 6 cities. Like, these people are just staying home. They're not commuting anymore, they're not going shopping, they're just staying home. So that's another way to look at it. What I'm trying to show you is that with these big data sets, it can be really overwhelming. There's so much data, I don't really know what to look at. But there are lots of ways to identify anomalies, whether it's time series, whether it's static, whether it's dynamic, so on and so forth. So the recovery process was very varied. It really depended where you were. So what I did is I used the first 7 days in the data set before any hurricane as my baseline. So in each city, I say, okay, each of these days, that's my baseline. Take the average as like 100%. And then in the subsequent days, I compare that the number of users in that city to that average, so that I can compare different cities on the same scale. So August 25, oh wait, Corpus Christi is the first hit. Oh, that makes sense, that's what we know. But clearly you see 40% of users are present in Corpus Christi as the hurricane made landfall. It's huge. I mean, only 40% of people left. But that's also huge because they haven't left. 40% of people didn't leave. I mean, Corpus Christi was not everywhere under evacuation order. And then it takes several days to go back to normal. So you can really measure the recovery process between the time it goes back to like 100% and 90%. What's also interesting is you see that people evacuated to Austin. Like you have 140% of people in Austin that day. And then you really see the storm progression. So a few days later, this is Houston, this is Conroe, Beaumont. So cities are slightly up the coast. You know exactly when they get hit. When Houston went down to like 25% of their users, number of unique people in Houston. It's a huge city. Think of the actual number of people. And then you see on the right, Beaumont, which is really like with the border with Louisiana. It took them forever to recover. Like it took them almost 10 days to go back to normal because they were flooded so badly, so people didn't come back. And so it's interesting to sort of be able to measure how situation was very different across different areas. And it really depends on the level of flooding, depends on whether they were ordered to evacuate or not. So then you can look at origin-destination pairs, which ones are more effective. So this is everything from Corpus Christi, did the same thing, normalized. I'm sorry, I thought this could be bigger. So you see exactly which cities people from Corpus Christi are evacuated to and from. And you see which ones have trouble recuperating. This is actually Beaumont, I remember it that hard. Like no one's going for Corpus Christi to Beaumont, there's no point. But it takes like 2 weeks to recover. So, comparing evacuations. Evacuating is a very tricky process. You do it wrong. So actually, Houston is a good use case because I think it was in 2004, was Hurricane Rita was supposed to hit Houston. It did not. But Houston went under evacuation order, meaning the entire city went on the one highway, got into a massive gridlock. It was a sunny day, and people die of heat strokes. Like, it's really bad when you don't evacuate, like when you have an evacuation order and it doesn't go well. So this time around, they're like, no, we're not evacuating them. But they did ask for evacuation around Corpus Christi. So what I compared is, on the top, percent of users per zip code with mandatory evacuation, in the middle, voluntary evacuation, and then no evacuation. And of course, these are very different data sets. We only have 24 zip codes under mandatory evacuation, 38 with voluntary evacuation. Bottom is without evacuation, so 630. What's interesting is twofold. So people do evacuate quite a bit. So on the zip codes with mandatory evacuation, you see a big jump just before the event. So you see that green bar striding up. So people leave, and because they go through the same zip code to evacuate, you see a spike in number of users, and then you see how many people are left. But still, 40% of people are still there in the zip code with mandatory evacuation. 40% of people have not left, and there could be lots of reasons. Old people don't have means to travel. People are afraid to lose their job if nothing happens and they don't show up for work. I mean, there are lots of social demographics aspects to it. But FEMA knows that people don't evacuate, but it's very hard for them to figure out what to do about it. And then you see that voluntary evacuation, nobody cares. If you're in a voluntary evacuation, nobody's going to leave. Like, this barely shoots up a couple %. But you end up in the same situation. On average, you're still at 45% during the event. You're like, okay, so they had to evacuate anyways, but just waited until the very last minute, which is not good either. And finally, zip codes without evacuation, that covers a lot of different cases, places where you didn't expect to have flooding and so. Oh, okay, never mind. Let's try this again. No, I don't know what happened. Okay. You see the bars are much wider because you have so many different cases in those zip codes. But you do have zip codes, if you look at the extremes of the bar, that are still going to like 10%. So these zip codes, people have to leave. When the situation is difficult, they still leave. Or you could have infrastructure damage and you don't have measurements. You have a few different situations. So let's go into infrastructure damage. These are specific zip codes, normalized again, and you just see no measurements starting August 25th. No measurements starting August 27th, and so on and so forth. And you see when they go back to normal. So this one was like lost for 2 days. This one was lost for like 7 days. So you can also see infrastructure damage. That's important for several reasons. If you don't have infrastructure, you don't have communication. So you know that first responders, they need some equipment that they don't usually have. They can't rely on the usual means. So that's helpful. And generally, you also see that most of these zip codes were probably under evacuation orders because they had a spike beforehand. And then they lost coverage. So, okay, we can measure things. I claim we can measure things, but how right am I? So I took the FEMA housing assistance data. It's publicly available, it's reported by the government. And so for each zip code, if a person submitted a claim, a registration, first you have a registration for a given natural disaster, so in this case, Hurricane Harvey. You can count, they report that, and then they also tell you if the claim was approved for FEMA assistance, and they tell you if the claim was inspected, like somebody actually went to the home or the apartment and saw if there was damage. So this is the number of FEMA claims, like literally 400,000 registration. Sorry, more actually, 4 million, I can say, because I know that this is 800,000. So interestingly, you have more inspection that approved, or you might be approved even if you're not inspected if you submitted all the required information, all the pictures. And then I looked at how, like, the distribution of these claims per zip code. So you have a few zip codes with up to 10,000 registrations. That's 10,000 different households in need. And then you have some of just under 10. So imagine now, you have all these zip codes that may have registrations. So I looked at the correlation between, on the one side, FEMA data, so the number of valid registration per zip code for all of the zip codes, and then on the other side, for mobile phone data, for each day, like if you're 20% more users, 20% less users, so the percent deviation from normal volume of users. So before the hurricane, there's no correlation, it's actually negative. And all these dots are dark because the p-value is less than 0.05, so we know it is significant, statistically significant. But the days of the hurricane, then suddenly the correlation is positive. It's not a very high correlation, it's like 0.25, something like that. I looked at both Spearman and Kendall. The reason we don't use Pearson is because your data is not normally distributed. So you have to use Spearman and Kendall instead. And then after things resolve, so after a week, you no longer correlate it anymore. What I'm trying to say here, the null hypothesis is that there is no association between, on the right side, number of registration for FEMA and change in number of users in the zip code. What this is showing is that during a severe event like this Hurricane Harvey, indeed there is a correlation. So this is useful for several reasons. It takes months for FEMA to get all these claims. People, when they're evacuating, are not necessarily writing down all the FEMA paperwork. They're busy evacuating, but they're busy being in shelters, so on and so forth. They're busy calling on jammed phone lines. So it takes months to get this data. With mobile phone data, you could have an estimate of the number of people affected. I'm going to say that within a few days, but probably a few hours, depending on which system you're using. But it's almost real time, it's very granular, and it has coverage. And it works. I actually redid this experiment. I don't have the slides here, because there's housing data and then there's individual assistance. And individual assistance data from FEMA, they actually give you the precise number of people who were in the household who were helped. And the correlation is much higher with the number of people, because whether you have a claim that can cover several people with a cell phone, so the correlation is not 1-to-1, but if you have the exact number of people affected, the correlation is higher. Okay, how do you scale this? Because I just showed you Hurricane Harvey, a month of data. Turns out you can do this for the entire US. So I took 4 months of location data, the entire US. I did like from late August 2018 to end of December 2018. That's 32 terabytes of data. Who knows, like, how much storage do you have on your personal computer? Can somebody tell me? Yeah. Okay. So you need some compute power for this, just to be able to, process this, store this, run any sort of process on it. So this is all the days. What I did is for each of the zip codes, I counted the number of daily unique users in that zip code, the entire US. That's about 33,000 zip codes. So for each zip code, I get a time series that tells me today in zip code 94040 in Mountain View, I had 10,000 people, the day after 12,000, and so on. And so I run a simple anomaly detection algorithm, daily and hourly, on each of these time series. And then I do it per state, and I tell you per state, so the anomaly detection algorithm tells me today there's an anomaly in this zip code. So per state, I just count the number of zip codes with anomaly. So my data started just at the end of August, so I need like 7 days to sort of have a sort of smoothing factor. So Labor Day is an anomaly for most states, we expect that. And then in blue you have wildfires in California. In green you have Hurricane Florence in North Carolina, South Carolina in pink. Here you have Hurricane Michael in Florida, Alabama, and Georgia. Wildfire in California early in November. This is Thanksgiving. The anomaly, interestingly, just before and after. People don't move the day of Thanksgiving, they travel before and after. So you see the anomalies there. This is a snowstorm in North Carolina. This is Christmas before and after. So you can just see the entire US. You can exactly tell for each natural disasters, since we don't have coverage of the entire population, but we have enough, like literally 1/4 of the entire population in the US, so that's sufficient, and it's not very biased. You can see how many people are affected for each natural disaster in close to real time. And with simple tools. We just need power and compute. This is big data processing. I'm not using a fancy machine learning algorithm or anything like that. It's just a matter of looking at the right data in the right way. So by now, I hope I have convinced you that you can get reliable measurements on whether evacuation orders are being followed, the immediate impact of a natural disaster, the speed of the recovery process. I believe personally, and I'll say this as me, not necessarily my company, but because I don't stand for what I am not allowed to publicly make statements about that. First responders, particularly when phone lines are jammed and infrastructure is damaged, really could use this. Right now, they're relying on a lot of Twitter or self-report information. Problem with Twitter is that it's skewed toward young people, and it's skewed toward one person showing a very heartbreaking picture, but it might not be representative of the whole population and who needs it the most. Decision makers, when they decide to evacuate or not, they don't really have history about what happened during evacuation. They know the news, how it was perceived, they have some data, but not across the entire US. And generally, I mean, some hurricanes strike every year in Florida, but not all cities have done this before. And government agencies could be interested in this as well. So, as a conclusion, mobile phone data has the potential to transform how we tackle several problems in transportation, from the strategic to the tactical phases by providing granular, large-scale, almost unbiased, near real-time information. More generally, passive sensors, the Internet of Things, everything you carry, your Fitbit, I'd go to say the insurance stuff on your car, your nice little dash cam, your camera at home to see if somebody's stealing your Amazon packages. All of this is generating data that is supposed to dwarf the consumer internet. By consumer internet, I mean Google, Facebook, of the world. This data is much bigger than it's growing so fast, it's going to be much bigger. Patterns that used to be hidden or unobservable are now becoming observable. And we are bypassing things that used to be completely proprietary, like airline passenger information. And the problem with this is that only CS majors seems to be able to handle this type of problem. The problem with that is they don't have the background in transportation. You need that knowledge. So if you take one thing from this talk, is please improve your coding skills. This is important. I mean, I'm not the greatest coder, but you need some decent coding skills. You can't rely on surveys. You can't rely on people saying, oh, we think this from our observations in the Bay Area. Like, if you want to make some policy changes, I know some of you in the room are doing policy stuff, you want to look at the big picture, not locally what's going on. So I hope this gave you some food for thought. I'd like to acknowledge you, Dr. Shrivastava and Dr. Das from Verizon, and Dr. Ferron, Dr. Aude, and Philippe Monmousseau from Georgia Tech. And I'll take any questions. Go ahead.
Well, really great talk, thank you.
Thank you.
To go back to the evacuation data, are you able to get specific routing information?
Yes.
So you can keep the lat long in there and get it on certain routes, or are you still going by zip code?
No, I can't keep it. The reason is I was trying to just show that we could do it. And keeping the lat long is just extra processing and space. Yeah. It's doable. Yeah. Yes.
And have you used any of this to validate current existing evacuation models that have been developed?
No, but something that could definitely be done. we haven't. Because honestly, I wasn't that familiar with evacuation stuff before. Like, it took me a long time just to learn about how this is done. Or just pull manually a CSV with the evacuation zip codes and all of that.
In an ideal world, I think people would see companies like Verizon, AT&T, Sprint provide some form of aggregated data to public agencies, clearly for demand modeling as a starter, but probably many other things. And this would have been already possible 5 years ago, but somehow this has not happened.
No.
I think the privacy may be an issue, but it seems, is it more of a business model issue? Because privacy can
I think it's the problem is that they don't see the value. So there is now more inside companies to do social good, to give back, especially when you get bad press, let's be clear. But I think until now, most of their business models was really advertisement. And nobody has really been looking at this sort of stuff. It's rare for them to get transportation graduates into this sort of program. They expect CS majors to work on this big data stuff. And I think it's just a pipeline issue, getting people with that sort of mindset to access it.
And do you think there's ever a pathway for live pipeline between telco or access providers and public agencies like Department of Transportation? I mean, university aside.
I think yes. I think it could be doable.
Okay.
It's a matter of getting the right people in the room. Any more questions?
I think in the past, the last example, you talk a lot about the natural disaster evacuation. This relates to a very important concept of resiliency. People have developed lots of models about how to improve infrastructure resiliency, but I think the data will be very valuable to evaluate all these efforts.
I think I really love modeling. One thing that became clear to me during my PhD is modeling is great, but then you need to actually test your models, and if you don't have data, that's hard. And so, or going back to the example of Cesar setting up goals for door-to-door passenger time, it's nice to have goals, but then if you can't even measure them, what are you supposed to do with them? How do you know you're working in the right direction? Or will it take you years to gather the data to say, oh, well, this policy really wasn't that great? Or when they introduced in the US, I think it was in the 70s, like allowing people to turn right at the red light on the road, that turns out to create a lot more accidents by the time we didn't think it would. It just took years of collecting that data to realize it. Does that end? Sure. Go ahead.
Regarding the evacuation, there have been some proposals to do it very nicely. So I'm glad to see that it really can be captured. The proposals were how to recover the city post-evacuation. And for that, we have two situations. One is just after, in which you need to give goods to people that they need to be displayed. So it's what we call short-time response and nicely long-time response, because some people, well, you know.
So
then the question is, one of the doubts we had that I needed to take to ask to a phone operator person is, up to what extent the fact that people lost the signal on the phones is going to affect our post-recovery proposal? Do you know anything about that?
Yes. So you would see users disappearing.
But because the tower disappear, or just
both?
Okay, we need to just.
Yeah. So you need to look in detail.
And for the recovery also, it would be nice to do it at the tower level, so that you can reach.
Yeah, so I'm trying to stay clear of any privacy concerns. If you do think that at the tower level you might have very low counts of people.
No, we're talking about rescuing.
Yeah.
And it means I guess
so
in that moment.
For these use cases, yes, you can bypass privacy.
Right.
For emergencies, yes.
You'll get good press.
Yeah. One thing, going back to your point, I looked at some of these disasters in more detail. What's interesting is long-term recovery. So when you look at 4 months, I looked, for instance, at Panama City in Florida, had another hurricane. You see that they settled for a new normal. Like the number of people, like they haven't, like clearly a whole part of the city was destroyed, and there's a new normal. I looked at Paradise in California with Campfire, new normal as well. Or you see cities that go back to their original level. So you know they had some evacuations, maybe some destruction, but people have come back. So you can distinguish that. And before anyone else.
Is Verizon interested in such proposals?
Potentially. So that's always, I can't promise anything. It's a matter of talking. Any more questions? Yes?
Yeah, is there a way of collecting data on the rates of evacuation? What is the average speed or an evacuation occurs on?
I don't have a good answer for you, unfortunately.
Yeah. Is it because of the
because it's
data
sensitive.
collection?
Because it's sensitive to share that.
Huh?
Because it's sensitive to share such data.
Yeah, right. Would 5G help in collecting that kind of data?
Well, 5G will help. The problem is that 5G deployment at the countrywide level is not for today.
Okay.
It's going to take years.
Yeah, fine, because the thinking is that I run into this many times that there's an automotive congestion and it's faster to move by bicycle or
Thank
something.
You have another question, Alex?
So, in the case of evacuation, does the cell tower ever collapse to the point that that data might become?
So basically, if you go back, I go back to here. Yeah. So basically, we lost coverage in that zip code. There were still 50% of users here, but at least you know how many people were there before it happened. So you get some estimate. That's better than nothing. Any more questions? Go ahead.
I know you talked about how 88,000 rescue workers came in to the area or some kind of...
No, I talked about, 800,000 FEMA assistance requests.
I was wondering, does your data, does it account for that, like the influx of people, or could that... So,
because I took a fairly large area of Texas, I don't expect a lot of people to come outside of it. But you could measure influx. Yes, we have the Aude pairs. We can definitely measure influx. So for the case of Paradise, California, you can see people leaving and going, and that would typically be first responders. All right. Any other questions? I guess we're right on time. Thank you all for coming today. I appreciate it.